Well, welcome back. This is ELEVENSES. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training, and this is my second attempt at running my live webcast this morning, Wednesday, the 25th of January. A few technical glitches there. I have no idea what the problem was. For some reason, the USB link to the Ethernet wasn't working properly, and neither was the link to my show contents, which refused to appear. You set all these things up, and then Windows decides it's going to do an update. I don't know whether that was the cause, but anyway, whatever. I am now here. So thanks very much for waiting and looking back in. What have we got for you today? Well, in today's show then, sub-zero temperatures in London, but no anti-ice treatments. The Outer London Council rebellion against the extended ULEZ zone is growing. Residents of Dulwich, they're fighting a low traffic neighbourhood scheme, perhaps through the courts. A little bit London-centric there, but we'll head off now to Pakistan, where Suzuki's subsidiary have stopped taking orders for motorcycles. CFMoto, on the other hand, in China, are working on a 1000cc V4. And then finally, we'll be looking at today's discussion point, which is a study from New Zealand which supports the thinking that most crashes are not down to poor behaviour, something I've been saying for a while, and now we have, it seems, some solid evidence in terms of research. So we'll finish up by having a look at that at the end of the show. Right, okay, don't forget, if you do have comments or questions, I'm very happy to hear them. Little bit of housekeeping before we go any further. Don't forget, of course, that the latest in the series of live online talk events is scheduled for the 1st of February, and that will be a Science of Being Seen in depth. And I'll be looking at day riding lights, the history of the research, the current state of research, proposals for what might work more effectively than what we have at the moment, which is effectively a low beam headlight, which of course points your light in completely the wrong direction. So that's all in the Science of Being Seen in depth, Wednesday, 1st February, 8 p.m. It is live. Don't forget, though, you can watch it on catch up if you can't make it live. Bookings are available now. Do pop over there if you possibly can to my survival skills tidyhq.com page, and you can book it over there. I'll just pop the link up for you as I normally do. You'll find it here. Right, okay, so on with the news now. On Monday morning, I had to take the car out to deliver the other half to her volunteer job at the Animal Rescue Centre, and I noticed two things. First of all, that the local road, which had been looking more and more like downtown Mariupol every single day, has had the pothole fixers out. But the interesting thing is that the road was in such a bad state that they didn't bother to repair the small holes. So they've basically done some half-baked repairs on the biggest holes. Basically filled them and squashed in some tarmac, but they've left other areas where the road surface has clearly failed, and they've just ignored those. So there are places where the surface is collapsing into a pothole, but the pothole hasn't quite appeared yet. But they also left one hole which is fist size. You could get your fist in it and put your fist deep into it, fist deep, and that was in the middle of a bunch of other potholes which they've repaired either side, but they didn't bother to fix this one. Now, you know, that'll be 30 centimeters across again in just a matter of days, and the other holes will be arriving in weeks. I think it's completely mad that they've actually bothered to send a team out to do that repair, and half of the potholes have been deemed not worth repairing, which is absolutely bonkers. Right, Kevin's looked in. Good morning again, Kevin. Right. The second thing that I noticed while I was out was, despite the nighttime temperatures having dropped to well below zero for a week or more now, so that on Monday the road surface was actually so cold that it was icy at 9 a.m. I skid tested it on the way down before I got to the main road, just to find out how much grip there was, and there wasn't very much at all. And there was ice on the pavement at 2 p.m. On Monday, whilst I was actually writing this piece. Now, there's no evidence, despite this deep freeze, that Brent Council have actually sorted any of the roads around here. Now, aside from the ice, what gave it away was the suspiciously clean nature of the cars that are running around. I suddenly realised that as two cars were facing me at a set of traffic lights, that one of them was absolutely filthy. So it's obviously been out of town on salted roads, and everything else in London seems to be spotlessly clean still. Now, I mentioned that Direct Line had reported that they had closed their 2022 figures with a loss due to paying out much more than they expected on car insurance. They said that was down to the icy weather in December. I was a bit skeptical at the time, but now I'm actually wondering how many extra crashes have been caused by the slippery roads that haven't been de-iced. Right, okay. Kevin says the whole country's broken. Early Mad Max movies becoming reality. And Paul says, in my opinion, no local authority which allows its roads to fall into such abysmal states of repair, they should be expelled from the local road safety partnership. They cannot preach safety to road users whilst failing to provide a safe environment. Now, funnily enough, I'm going to come back to that theme at the end of the show in my today's discussion piece, whilst I look at that NZ study. So yeah, bear that in mind. Meanwhile, the ULEZ zone expansion, of which I do this time have the right photograph for you to look at. There it is. If you look at that, you will see the three zones. Now, the very central zone there, right in the middle, that was the original ULEZ zone, right in the centre of London. Then the slightly darker green shade, which, as you can see, goes out to the north and south circular roads, that's the extended ULEZ zone. I happen to be a few hundred metres into the top end of it, so every time I drive my elderly camper anywhere, I have to pay ULEZ. And then there is the extension that is being proposed and is due to come in on the 29th of August. Now, that goes out almost to the M25, and it's starting to get pushback from those councils who are on the fringes of the scheme. So, for example, I mentioned Sutton, which is down in this part of the sort of down here somewhere, were refusing to allow the TfL engineers to actually put their cameras up on Sutton's own infrastructure. And their argument was that Sutton doesn't benefit from the transport links that the inner city does. You'll recall that the reasons for the extension of the ULEZ zone is to fund TfL and to help it recover from the losses it made during the pandemic, when TfL was obviously operating a transport service for essential workers. Now, right now, there are a total of 9 councils who are rebelling against the extension. 3 are controlled by Lib Dems. 6, not too surprisingly, given we have a Labour mayor, are Tory majorities. Richmond on Thames is the latest council, and they have joined Harrow, Hillingdon, Croydon, Sutton, Bromley, Bexley, Havering, and Kingston in the plan. Now, one of the areas that has been in dispute, Sutton says that TfL can't go in and put their cameras up. This is an example, for example, one of the cameras that you find in central London. Now, TfL have responded by saying that they don't actually need local authority permission so long as they install it on their own existing signage infrastructure. And that means they could install around 2/3 of the 2,700 CCTV cameras which need to go up. And that would allow the scheme to go ahead despite the opposition. Whether there'll be big holes in the scheme is another matter. But anyway, the In response to that, the latest news is that the consortium of boroughs that are objecting to the scheme are looking for routes to legally challenge the extension of ULEZ, which, as I say, is due to come into force in August. Now, if a legal challenge failed, it could end up in the High Court, of course. The councils would have to pick up TfL's costs, which could cost them millions, so that is a factor to consider. But rather sadly, I think the debate is actually turning into a party political ping pong argument. Questions being asked in the House. And the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has been reported saying that clean air was a human right. And he was quoted as saying, I think those councils, they're conservative councils for party political reasons. Well, clearly they aren't all. That's 3 Lib Dems I just mentioned, who are opposing these policies, need to ask themselves the question, what is their response to those bereaved families in their boroughs who have lost their lives because of the poor quality in the air? I think that's a particularly dangerous kind of claim to make. And he went on to say that the largest number of people with respiratory diseases are in outer London. The largest number of deaths are in outer London. The councils that are opposing it are councils with the largest number of deaths. Now, I don't have the data to tell you whether that is correct or not, but what I can say is that there are around 3.5 million people living in inner London and around 5.5 million in outer London. So if the mortality rate per head of population were exactly the same, then the gross numbers would clearly be higher for outer London, simply because more people live there. It wouldn't imply that the air quality is worse in outer London. And frankly, with the lower traffic density, I find it hard to believe that overall air quality is worse in outer London than inner London. No doubt there are hotspots. Now, the inner London ULEZ zone didn't actually produce the income that TfL were anticipating, at least partly because there was a quicker switch to compliant vehicles than was expected. Around 4 out of 5 vehicles don't need to pay ULEZ. Now, a spokesman for the Mayor said it's only the most polluting vehicles doing the most damage to our health that are affected. And the Mayor has announced the biggest scrappage scheme yet, 110 million to help Londoners who need it the most. Now, unfortunately, of course, the people with the oldest cars, the ones that are the most polluting, are usually the least well off, and those are the ones who are going to be least able to afford a new vehicle, scrappage scheme or not. Right, okay. Couple of comments here. Richard says that South Gloucestershire has a facility where you can report a pothole online and they will fill it. It has to be a minimum of 30 centimetres diameter. So that's a foot across. He says the system works well for ones he has reported. And Kevin points out that some non-ULEZ compliant vehicles emit the same or lower emissions as some compliant vehicles. Yeah, absolutely. And that was the nonsense of simply imposing a cut-off point on the registration plate. There will be identical vehicles that were registered literally one day apart. One will be pre the right number on the plate, and the other one will be the wrong number on the plate. So one person would have to pay it, the other wouldn't. There are various routes forward. You can get certificates of compliance from the manufacturer, but frankly, it's a nonsense system. Coming back to potholes, Samantha says the ones I've reported in Devon take months to get fixed and so get larger and more dangerous. Yeah, I would agree. They are in a horrible state, most of our roads. But the councils can always find money for safety schemes, and in Southwark, in South London, for example, hundreds of neighbours have banded together to fight a new low traffic scheme for their neighbourhood, which they claim was forced upon them. Now, 5 residents' associations have told Southwark Council they are considering seeking a judicial review over the consultation process for their area's 6th low traffic network. The council is proposing to close a busy junction to make it the, quote, safest, most accessible space for people walking and using mobility aids and people cycling. And the residents say that or the council rather, say it will create more of a village feel, but they also point out that blue badge holders will also be excluded from the area. Now, in a legal letter signed by no less than 617 residents, they allege that the council have acted unlawfully by failing to make clear what the proposal was and why it was under positive consideration. And they point out the results of past legal cases as precedent. Now, they also claim that the council failed to publish the surveys and the cycling and disability audits whilst the consultation was open, and it was only open for 20 days too. The letter then says that the council basically used the survey responses to selectively present a misleading picture of the initial engagements with the community because the council's survey questions were structured so as to force the council's own analysis upon residents to suggest that the proposal to close Turney Road enjoys specific public support. Now, I would not disagree with that, having been involved many years ago in a bypass consultation. One of the things that the council did there was they gave you an either or chance of responding to it. You could either vote for a bypass on one side of the village or you could vote for a bypass on the other side of the village. You couldn't say that you didn't think the bypass was a good idea. So they automatically would have a majority on one side or the other. Effectively, they'd made the decision to go ahead with it, and damn what the residents thought. That's another story altogether. But Catherine Rose, who's the Cabinet Member for Leisure, Parks, Streets and Clean Air at Southwark Council, said she made no apology for improving the streets for school children and that existing schemes have been a tremendous success for walking and cycling. And she said, we adhere to statutory requirements to ensure that any consultation process is fair, transparent and accessible. We design our surveys to capture the full range of responses from the community in an unbiased manner so that all voices inform any decision. Frankly, I think that surveys like this ought to go before an independent body to be audited, because I honestly don't think that these surveys are actually fair and neutral. I think they do ask loaded questions. I think they are designed to get the response that the council wants. And I honestly think that before such a survey is actually allowed to go forward, there ought to be an independent audit. There also might just be a cash motive too. Last year, around 1,000 residents in Dulwich staged a protest demanding the removal of the central village LTN because it had collected 6.6 million in fines in 2021 across 5 cameras, people violating the scheme, probably unwittingly in many cases. So, okay, now moving away from the UK, we're over to Pakistan. Now, it's not just the UK economy that's under pressure at the moment. The Pakistan has actually seen the rupee plummeting and inflation at decades high levels. And they've had devastating floods out there, of course, and they have also been affected, like other countries, by the global energy crisis. Right now, apparently thousands of containers packed with essential food items, medical equipment, but also industrial parts have been held up at Pakistan's Karachi port as the country is grappling with a desperate foreign exchange crisis. Basically, they lack the dollars for the banks to issue letters of credit for importers. So the result is a shortage of imported parts and materials has put the brakes on almost all industry, including the automotive industry, with an alarmingly high number of companies, according to the report I read from Pakistan, shutting down their operations. Now, amongst the industries affected is Suzuki's local distributor and subsidiary PAC Suzuki Motor Company. They announced last Thursday that they are now taking no further orders for Suzuki motorcycles which are locally built until further notice, citing import-based supply chain bottlenecks and unpredictable manufacturing capabilities. And the spokesman said, under the present economic circumstances, import-based supply chain constraints and uncertain production possibilities, we are unable to serve new customers. And that letter went out to all dealers. We will therefore stop bookings of our motorcycle products from January 20th, 2023 for the time being. They did promise, however, to resume bookings when the situation becomes more favorable. So if you want to go and buy a bike in Pakistan from Suzuki, one of the locally manufactured models, you could be in trouble. Now, don't forget, if you want to catch up with these shows, which normally go out at 11 o'clock, slight glitch this morning, of course, you can find them on Facebook, where they originally were broadcast, or more conveniently on YouTube, where they also now go out live on my UK Survival Skills UK channel over there on YouTube. And they are all neatly indexed in their own folder, so you can catch any show anytime over there. All right, okay, so if you have followed ELEVENSES, you'll know that Chinese motorcycle manufacturers are looking to make inroads into the internal combustion engine market, and their bikes over the last few years have become increasingly sophisticated. Even if here in the UK many riders are still reluctant to consider going onto a Chinese motorcycle, but it is becoming increasingly hard to ignore their machines, particularly as a growing number of European manufacturers are actually sourcing their engines now from Chinese manufacturer. Jiang, for example, supplies Benelli, and CFMoto's bigger engines are based on KTM's engine development too. Now, as I reported here last year, another Chinese manufacturer, Bender, they've shown off a pair of homegrown V4 designs, one a 500, the other an 98cc motor with 57 and 154 horsepower outputs. And another manufacturer that I hadn't previously heard of, called Cove, have shown off a rather lovely looking 400 inline 4. And it seems now that CFMoto, who probably are the most familiar Chinese manufacturer over here, their range currently tops out with a pair of 91 horsepower twin cylinder 800 models, which are derived from their cooperation with their partner KTM, but they have moved the game forward fairly significantly. Take a look at this. That is a new V4 engine which appeared in a patent which was filed by CFMoto in 2022. It appears to have only just surfaced, but that is looking, analysts say, like a typical short stroke design with top end performance in mind. And the speculation is that the motor could pump out around 200 horsepower, so it would be a fairly significant development for a Chinese manufacturer. And this is the sketch of the bike that it is likely to go into, and it's being speculated it'll be the CFMoto 1000RR. So it's clearly a sports bike design. Now, where has the engine come from? Well, the angle between the cylinder banks on the motor itself is 75 degrees, and combined with what is described as a short rocker arm and heavy water cooling, more than one online source has suggested that there could well be ties to KTM's earlier V4 MotoGP bikes. These were pensioned off at the end of the 2016 season as they switched to a 90-degree V-twin. So why the sudden interest from CFMoto in a 200 horsepower sports bike? Well, I can think of several reasons. The first is it gives KTM something back on their development costs for the MotoGP bike, if they can actually use what they developed for a road bike. And it would, of course, allow KTM to launch a class-leading sports bike at the time others, notably Suzuki, of course, are pulling out of internal combustion engine bikes altogether. That would give them a possibly dominant bike in World Superbikes, for example. As for CFMoto's interest, then look no further than the QJ Motors Superbike project. They are linked up with European bike manufacturer MV Agusta, and they are also reportedly developing a 1000cc sports bike which would use the 200 horsepower inline 4-cylinder engine that's currently found in the Brutale. Okay. Paul says, going back to the issue about the surveys. He says not just councils which are guilty of manipulating surveys to their own ends. I've recently seen the results of an industry survey with a 1.22% response rate, 5 responses, as a result of which a decision on policy has been flipped 180 degrees. That is barking mad, Paul. Completely unjustified. Yeah, and Kevin says it's troubled times, corruption, debt, greed, and unethical behaviour. Yes, absolutely. Gaslit by corporate blur. Well, yes, I wouldn't disagree, unfortunately. Right, okay, so if you're still with me, it's time for the discussion piece that I talked about at the top of the show. Now, firstly, as I said, there's no evidence that Brent Council have sorted any roads this January, apart from the ice everywhere. It's the clean nature of the vehicles that are running around that gave that one away. And as I also mentioned, the insurance company Direct Line had reported that they had had a loss, which they put down to many more claims during the icy weather in December. And I was a bit skeptical, as I said at the time, but I now wonder how many of those crashes have been caused by slippery roads. Now, as it happens, I got an alert to a study carried out by the New Zealand AA Research Foundation back in 2018, thanks to Malk, who often watches these on Catch Up, by the way. Their research foundation manager, Simon Douglas, says that the results of this study challenge the commonly held belief that deliberate reckless behaviours such as drunk driving or driving at extreme speeds are the most common causes of fatal crashes. Now, the study actually found that unintentional errors and not reckless behaviour were behind the majority of serious injury crashes. Now, if I say anything else, let's define an accident. It's a word that's gone out of favour with the emergency services, but it is used throughout research into road safety because there is a definition of accident, and it can be defined as an unplanned event generally associated with negative consequences such as fatalities, injuries, or physical damage to vehicles. So, what about human error? Let's talk about human error. There are 3 kinds that are recognized. Now, the first kind is known as a slip or a lapse, and these are the sort of mistakes that are made inadvertently, often by experienced operators performing a routine task where we substitute one action for another in a procedure. Maybe we depress or push the gear lever before we fully depress the clutch. You know, even an experienced driver might do that occasionally. I've certainly done it. And a lapse, on the other hand, is a failure of memory. So you're forgetting an overall goal, forgetting where you are in a procedure. So maybe that would be failing to check a mirror before turning right. So these are described as execution errors because they tend to happen when we're in the middle of a sequence of actions that we have learned to make. Now, the second type of error are mistakes, and these differ from those slips and lapses because they are the result of a conscious decision that the operator made at the time of the accident. Now, the likelihood is, of course, that the operator believed that the decision was correct, but was subsequently found to be wrong. The decision might be rule-based, or it might be some problem solving. It might involve something like being caught by surprise by a green traffic light turning amber. We may have assumed that light would stay green a lot longer than it did and then be caught in 2 minds when the light actually changed. It might be problem solving. We might look at a bend, decide the particular speed is the right speed for a bend, and then of course halfway around the bend we discover we're going too fast. But whatever the reason, the important thing here is normally hindsight, either ours or somebody else's, that tells us we made the wrong choice. And then there's the third type of human error, which is the violation, which is a deliberate deviation from the rules of safe operation. So this would be a deliberate choice to run a red light, for example, hoping that nothing's coming the other way. Whilst I don't like to demonize any particular road group, we see cyclists making this kind of decision every day of the week, and it's not unknown for car drivers and motorcyclists to do the same. So those are the violations, deliberate decisions. Now, the AA Research Foundation study, which was carried out by the Mackey Research at Auckland University and an organisation called TERNZ, Transport Research New Zealand, it was based on a detailed reports which were obtained for 300 passenger vehicle crashes that either resulted in a fatality or in a serious injury. Now, the press report of this NZAA study says that the researchers found that mistakes and unintentional errors were behind the majority of the serious injury crashes. And to quote, "The public's focus on road safety often gets stuck on drunk drivers and extreme speeds, but our study showed that many more serious crashes involved everyday drivers going about their ordinary business when something went wrong and they were seriously injured. In around 3/4 of crashes where vehicle occupants were seriously injured, the drivers were generally following the rules of the road, but they made a mistake or poor decision, or something unexpected happened." Now, I'd be wrong to overlook the study's conclusion that reckless behaviour was implicated in 49% of the fatal crashes studied and in 29% of the serious injury crashes, but it does confirm what I've thought for a long time and have been talking about for getting on for a decade now as part of No Surprise, that most crashes that happen are not deliberate, they're not deliberated errors, they are accidents, genuinely accidental errors. The study offers that evidence that the majority of crashes are not a deliberate decision of a driver or rider to push their luck, whether that's speeding in an urban area, taking a corner far too quickly, or overtaking on a busy road, but they mostly involve road users who are trying to obey the rules of the road but crashed after making one of these slips, lapses, or mistakes. So it's human error, not human intention. Now, rather alarmingly, the research highlighted that 41% of the serious injury crashes actually involved a vehicle crossing the centre line on what they call an undivided 100-kilometre road. We would call that a single carriageway, when the driver was both sober and within the speed limits. Now, I suspect if that study were repeated here, we'd find a rather lower figure. Now, I know that some people listening to this will say that an error such as drifting across the centre line is simply poor driving, and would say that an alert driver or rider wouldn't do that. And that's the line of thinking, frankly, that we get from our very own health and safety executive, who say that human errors are caused, quote, by various factors, and then go on to point the finger firmly at the individual who made the mistake by saying they are caused by, quote, fatigue, stress, distraction, and poor training, and that slips and lapses are often due to lack of attention or loss of concentration. Now, what the health and safety executive is less than keen to point out is that many of those errors could have been prevented in the first place by better design. Now, a few years ago, I was driving an unfamiliar car. It was a VW Passat, as it happens. It was the very last model before they stuck a nice, pretty screen in it, and it had a very complex and confusing control panel with lots and lots of very identical buttons for that controlled the heater and controlled the sort of the CD, radio, whatever. So when I was driving along, all was going well until I drove into a sudden hailstorm in midsummer. And what happened was the windscreen misted up immediately. And my attempt to find the button that controlled the demister only succeeded in switching on the radio and then flipping between the CD player and FM. I Obviously, stopping dead in the middle of the road wasn't an option. So basically, I wiped the screen with one hand and peered through a little porthole until I could find somewhere to pull over. Now, that's a classic example of the system being the weak point here. It's not any real fault of the end user. You might argue that I should have been more aware of where the controls were, but frankly, they were so small and tiny, even when I got used to the controls, I still had to look down at them to find them. Whereas with most heater controls, you can find them by peripheral vision because they are very distinct and very different from the radio controls. So that is completely poor design, and arguably another poor design choice was Honda switching the indicator button and the horn buttons positions on more modern machines. Everybody knows where the horn is on a motorcycle. It's on the left hand and it's at the bottom of the switch cluster. Suddenly moving it just causes confusion for end users. So that is, again, a poor piece of system design. Something else that the HSE don't mention is that performing repetitive tasks for long periods while staying alert isn't easy either. It could be operating a piece of machinery, it could be clicking on buttons on the screen, such as the ones that renew driving licenses, which explains why so many motorcycle licenses are sent out minus the motorcycle entitlement, or the sort of things we do when driving a car, which again are very, very repetitive. So it's not so much about being distracted by things going on in the car, such as disruptive passengers or mobile phone conversations. Yes, they are a problem, but it's the difficulty of maintaining a high level of focus for long periods. That's the human problem. Now, I would note that many New Zealand roads, particularly on the South Island, tend to be empty of traffic. They tend to have very long distances between towns, something that we're simply not used to driving in the UK. And that means drivers and riders are often travelling long distances too. So that is one reason I suspect that the New Zealand figures are slightly different from what we would find here. And the roads tend to be quite twisty, which would explain how easy it would be for a fatigued or an inattentive driver, remember, not because they are distracted by something else, but simply because repetitive tasks are difficult to perform at a high level of attention. It probably explains some of the crossover crashes. So however good our intentions are, and remember, no one actually sets out to crash, we are all fallible. Mr. Douglas, the chair of the AA's research organisation, he said, while we can all do more to be better drivers, part of the road safety challenge is recognising that there are still going to be times when drivers make mistakes, and that's why we also need to do more to keep lifting the safety of our vehicle and roads. Now, if you've got a lot of crossover crashes, how do you prevent that? Well, one way is put a barrier in place. So basically, you prevent the crossover collisions where they are common, and New Zealand has done that on a number of roads, I know. Another way is to make the impact of the crash less serious, and that's the thinking behind the ever-increasing standards in vehicle design. But New Zealand is a bit unique because it has a fairly large pool of older vehicles, many of which are, of course, driven by younger, higher risk drivers. Now, New Zealand has recently dropped the rural speed limit on single carriageway roads from 100 kph to 80 kph, which is roughly 62 to 50 miles per hour. Now, I'm never entirely convinced that this is not actually counterproductive. It might make a crash less likely to be fatal, but arguably, where driving distances are longer, as you find people doing in New Zealand, it also lengthens journey time. So very, very simple bit of mathematics: a 500-kilometre, 300-mile journey at an average speed of 100 kph would take 5 hours. Slow the drivers down to 80 kph, and the same journey is going to take an extra hour and a quarter. I'd be very interested to see any research into how much more fatigued that makes drivers. Arguably, it also reduces the stimulation from the driving task. If you are riding on or driving on a relatively straightforward bit of road and you have to keep the speed down for the speed limit and not drive at the speed that the road is suitable for. And there are other ways that we can perk up attention levels. I've talked about the perceptual countermeasures idea. If you recognize the rumble strips that you approach to roundabouts on fast dual carriageways, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Riders often bitch about them because the bike bounces around all over the place, but the reason that they're there is to help drivers recognize that they actually do need to slow down. Anyway, to conclude, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't come down hard on the genuine chancers and risk takers, but there's a really far from helpful tendency in road safety to heap blame on the people who got it wrong through human error. Fix the system, don't blame people who get it wrong. For example, a story caught my eye yesterday, a new average speed camera in Plymouth that had caught 23,000 drivers over the limit in the period under which the system was on test. It's now gone live and it's ticketed 16,000 more in less than a year. Now, why? If the intent is for that camera to reduce the speed, clearly the camera isn't working. And I'd suspect that a significant number of those drivers simply didn't know about the new low limit, or they, for some reason, crept up over the limit. Now, these are slips and lapses rather than deliberate violations. If the system worked, there would be zero violations. That is how a speed limit should work. Now, interestingly, a guide on designing computer error messages says that, quote, the message should be worded to take as much blame as possible away from the user and heap blame instead on the system. So you don't tell the user they press the wrong button. You basically give them another chance to press the right one. And that's a very different way of thinking from the way that we're typically told we should view user error on the roads. And I honestly believe that the way that we are taught to blame other road users for getting it wrong is at the root of a lot of the confrontational issues that actually happen out on our roads too. If we could all accept that human error is real and very, very often unintentional, and it's often a sign that there is a problem with the design of the system in which the error happens and in which we all operate, maybe, just maybe, there would be a change of driver and rider behaviour for the better to go with it. Right, that is my thought for the day. I'll be interested, of course, in any feedback you have on the stories today. I've already tried to answer as many as I possibly could. Kevin says near impossible to ascertain if someone has been subjective or objectively reckless in oversight contributing to a collision. I don't honestly believe that. How many crashes now caught on dash cam? How many crashes are caught on CCTV? I can recall an incident where a couple of riders on a group ride were all prosecuted as a result of a collision. I believe one of them was actually killed. They collided with an emerging car. And it was when they looked back at the CCTV footage over the several miles where they captured the group's behaviour, they found them all riding recklessly at high speed, pulling wheelies. Now, I'm sure that you can contrast that with a collision where a driver actually makes a genuine slip, lapse, and fails to see a motorcyclist who is minding their own business at the speed limit. There is a very different state of affairs in those collisions, and I'm absolutely certain that a proper investigation of the crash could ascertain those. If you can't, then I would say don't blame the driver, don't blame the rider. Look at the techniques that are used on the scene to work out what happens. Remember, system, check the system first before you start blaming the individuals using it. So that's what I would say to you there. Right, that is enough. We've overrun a little bit. It's nearly 12 o'clock now, thanks to the technical hitch at the beginning of the show. I do apologise for that. I hope it hasn't spoiled anybody's enjoyment of the show. I will go and edit those out of the record, so people will find the full-length show. But again, thanks for looking in. I very much appreciate all your support on these shows, of course. And if you are out there today on the roads, do try to stay shiny side up.